when Daniel, a conscientious mail carrier, embarked on his usual route through the serene Cherry Hill neighborhood. He never anticipated that an ordinary delivery would evolve into a pivotal moment in his life. Upon noticing peculiar stains on an elderly lady's trousers, an inexplicable urge compelled him to investigate further. What he uncovered inside her residence forced him to dial, and the reality was more horrifying than he had ever imagined. Stay tuned to reveal the startling truth behind this gripping encounter. Additionally, please share where you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing for more similar narratives. Let's get started. Daniel Rivera cherished the early mornings in Cherry Hill, New Jersey as his favorite time of day. The town lay quietly beneath a light mist, streets deserted, with the sun casting a gentle golden hue over the tranquil suburban homes. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant chirping of birds, providing Daniel with a sense of peace. The steady creak of his postal truck, the shuffle of letters in his hands, it had all become second nature to him. For Daniel, delivering mail was more than just a job. It was his way of connecting with the community. He was familiar with everyone, from the busy workers on Maple Avenue to the retirees on Chestnut Street, where the homes were a bit older but full of charm. No residence was more familiar to him than Mrs. Whitaker's. Every Monday and Thursday without fail she would open her door before he could even knock. Greeting him with a smile, she'd inquire about his day, share news about her garden, and always offer him a glass of lemonade during the summer. However, today was unlike any other. Daniel's van cruised down Chestnut Street. He felt an unusual sense of discomfort settle in. Initially subtle and almost dismissible, a lingering feeling that something was amiss, but as he neared Mrs. Whitaker's home, his concern intensified. Her typically immaculate lawn was now overgrown, wild grass sprouting through flower beds that had only last week showcased neatly arranged roses. The sight of weeds tangled within her once beautiful garden immediately drew Daniel's attention. Mrs. Whitaker was meticulous about her home's upkeep, regularly pruning her bushes and sweeping her porch. This sudden neglect was highly unusual. Daniel reduced his speed, parking the van along the curb and scrutinizing the house as if it might explain its unexpected state of disarray. His eyes moved from the encroaching weeds along the walkway to the stack of newspapers accumulating dust by the door, their edges yellowed from days of neglect. This was strange. Mrs. Whitaker always gathered her newspapers each morning without fail. Stepping out of the van, Daniel felt the crisp morning air against his skin, yet a bead of sweat formed at the back of his neck. His heart raced slightly. He reached for the mailbox and opened it, only to find it jam-packed with letters, so stuffed that several envelopes were angled awkwardly, seemingly shoved in hastily to accommodate more mail. Bills, catalogs, postcards, none of it had been sorted. For a fleeting moment, Daniel contemplated turning back, proceeding with his route as if nothing were wrong. Perhaps she was visiting family, he thought. Maybe she had simply forgotten to ask a neighbor to collect her mail. But the more he considered it, the more his intuition told him that wasn't the case. Mrs. Whitaker wasn't someone who left things unattended. Taking a deep breath, Daniel walked up the stone path toward her front door, the dry leaves crunching under his boots. He pressed the doorbell, its gentle chime echoing inside the house. Normally the sound would be followed by the familiar shuffle of Mrs. Whitaker's slippers and the turn of the brass doorknob as she greeted him warmly. Today, however, there was only silence. Daniel waited. 1 minute passed, then another. No movement from within, no faint greeting through the door. He leaned forward, straining his ears for any sound. Nothing. The house remained unnervingly quiet. Frowning, Daniel knocked on the door more firmly, the sound resonating louder than intended. He glanced around, hoping a neighbor might emerge to explain her absence. But Chestnut Street was as silent as ever, the stillness only broken by the rustling of a distant breeze through the trees. He knocked again, this time adding Mrs. Whitaker's name. Mrs. Whitaker? His voice carried through the quiet air but seemed absorbed by the stillness. There was no response. A chill ran down his spine, a blend of increasing concern and the undeniable realization that something was wrong. Mrs. Whitaker had never ignored him before. Even on days she wasn't expecting mail, she promptly greeted him at the door. Daniel took a step back, scanning the house's exterior for any clue that might explain her absence. The curtains were drawn, the windows dark and foreboding. The porch light, which usually turned on automatically in the evening, remained off above the door. His gaze returned to the mailbox, now overflowing with letters from days, perhaps weeks, of missed collections. Could she be inside, too weak to answer the door? Was she ill, injured, or worse? The thought gnawed at him, dispelling the brief hope that maybe she was simply on vacation. Daniel's hands felt clammy as he stepped off the porch, torn between his responsibilities as a mailman and the growing sense of duty he felt toward the people on his route. People like Mrs. Whitaker, who had always been so kind to him. As he returned to his van, a heavy feeling settled over him, making his usual routine seem wrong, almost insignificant. He threw the remaining mail onto the passenger seat and took one last look at the house. What if she truly was in trouble? Could he just leave? His mind raced with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a missed mail collection. Whatever was happening inside that house was far from an ordinary day in Cherry Hill. Daniel continued his route, but his usual efficiency had vanished, replaced by a persistent unease. He went through the motions, delivering letters, nodding to the occasional early riser, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The image of Mrs. Whitaker's overgrown lawn, the pile of newspapers, and the heavy silence at her door haunted him. He had always taken pride in being observant, understanding the rhythms of the community he served. In this instance, something was undeniably wrong. As he drove from house to house, the notion that something had happened to Mrs. Whitaker tormented him. She was elderly, lived alone, and had no children. Her husband had passed away years earlier, leaving her with only the neighborhood and her garden for companionship. Daniel had always admired her independence, how she maintained her quiet dignity, even as the years added more lines to her face and slowed her movements. Could she have fallen? Maybe she was inside, injured, unable to call for help. Or worse, what if she was ill and no one knew? The unsettling possibilities were endless, clouding his thoughts as he navigated the familiar streets of Cherry Hill. Approaching the end of his morning route, Daniel decided to take a break. His usual lunch spot, Lucy's Diner, was nearby. The small, family-owned diner had been a town staple for decades, its retro neon sign flickering in the sunlight. Lucy, the owner, knew everyone by name and always had a kind word and a smile for her regulars. Daniel parked his van in the diner's gravel lot, dust swirling as he pulled in. Inside, the warmth of the diner enveloped him, a stark contrast to the chilly feeling that had followed him all morning. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and fried eggs filled the air, but today the comfort didn't ease his mind. Lucy noticed him as soon as he entered. A sturdy woman with salt and pepper hair tied in a bun, she always seemed to smile, even when busy. She gestured him over while wiping down the counter. "You seem troubled today, Daniel," she said in her usual friendly manner, pouring him a cup of the diner's strong black coffee. Daniel settled into his usual booth by the window, the leather seat creaking under his weight. He gazed out at the street for a moment, watching cars pass by as if everything were normal. But his intuition told him otherwise. After a brief hesitation, he sighed. "I'm concerned about Mrs. Whitaker on Chestnut Street," he finally said, clutching the warm mug. "I haven't seen her in a while, and her mail. It's piling up." Lucy's smile faded, her brow furrowing with concern. "Mrs. Whitaker? The one with the flower garden out front?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, that's her. You know how particular she is about keeping things tidy, but today, her yard is a mess, her mail is untouched, and no one answered when I knocked." Lucy set down her rag, leaning against the counter. "Come to think of it, she hasn't joined her usual Tuesday lunch with the church ladies in a few weeks. She always sits right there by the window with her friends, ordering the same thing every time: chicken salad on wheat and iced tea. Her eyes showed worry. "Do you think something's wrong?" Daniel shrugged, though it didn't alleviate the tension in his shoulders. "I'm not sure, but it doesn't feel right. She's lived in that house as long as I've been on the route. Always punctual, always organized. Now this." Lucy glanced around the diner, as if answers might appear in the faces of patrons or in the morning bustle. But everything seemed normal, aside from the growing concern between them. "Do you think she might be ill?" Lucy asked, her voice lowering, a flicker of worry in her usually upbeat demeanor. "I hope not," Daniel replied, staring into his coffee as if the dark liquid could provide some insight. "But I have a bad feeling about it. What if she's hurt and can't call for help? I don't think she has anyone regularly checking on her." Lucy nodded thoughtfully. "Her husband passed years ago, didn't he? And I don't remember her mentioning any kids. Or maybe a niece or nephew, but no one nearby." She tapped her fingers on the counter, clearly pondering the same unsettling possibilities. "Well, if she hasn't been around and is missing her Tuesday lunches, that's definitely unusual. You should check on her again after your shift." "I will," Daniel assured her, a sense of determination creeping into his voice. His earlier hesitation had vanished, replaced by a resolve to ensure Mrs. Whitaker was safe. He'd seen too many news stories, elderly individuals found in their homes after days, sometimes weeks, without anyone noticing something was wrong. He couldn't let that happen on his watch. Lucy offered him a reassuring smile. "You have a good heart, Daniel. Mrs. Whitaker's lucky to have someone like you looking out for her." He tried to smile back, but it didn't reach his eyes. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, making the familiar comfort of Lucy's diner feel distant, almost alien. He took a sip of his coffee, but the bitterness didn't shake him out of his thoughts as it usually did. The lunch crowd began to fill in. Construction workers, office employees, and retirees taking seats around him. The diner buzzed with the clinking of plates and the low murmur of conversations. But Daniel's mind remained focused on Mrs. Whitaker. He thought of her small, quiet house, dark and still, with no signs of life inside. The image of her frail figure, possibly lying alone in need of assistance, refused to leave his thoughts. "Lucy," Daniel said after a moment of silence, "if I don't find her this afternoon, I think I'll call someone. The police, maybe. Do a welfare check." Lucy nodded, her eyes reflecting the seriousness of the situation. "You're doing the right thing. Sometimes people just slip through the cracks, you know. But you're making sure that doesn't happen. Just keep me updated, okay?" "I will," Daniel promised, standing to leave. The knot in his stomach remained, but at least he had a plan. He'd finish his route, then return to Chestnut Street to discover what was truly happening. As he exited the diner, the bell chiming above him, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a heavy blanket. He couldn't ignore this, couldn't simply continue his day as if Mrs. Whitaker was just another missed delivery. Something was wrong, and he was determined to find out what. With a resolute glance toward Chestnut Street, Daniel climbed back into his van, his mind racing with unanswered questions and the sinking feeling that time might be running out. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Chestnut Street, Daniel parked his postal van in front of Mrs. Whitaker's house. The golden light of early evening bathed the neighborhood in a soft glow, but for Daniel, the moment felt anything but peaceful. His unease had only intensified throughout the day, gnawing at him like an incessant itch. Now, standing at her doorstep for the second time, the situation felt even more critical. He exited the van, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the path. The yard appeared worse in the dimming light. More overgrown weeds, flowers drooping from neglect. The once charming house seemed to sag under the burden of abandonment. Daniel paused at the door, taking a deep breath before pressing the doorbell. The chime echoed softly inside, but this time it was met with a faint sound. He heard it, slow, faint footsteps on the other side of the door. His pulse quickened, and for a fleeting moment he felt a surge of relief. Mrs. Whitaker was alive, at least. But as the door slowly opened, that relief transformed into dread. The woman before him was a mere shadow of the Mrs. Whitaker he knew. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The transformation was startling. Her silver hair, once meticulously styled, now hung in greasy, tangled strands around her face. Her once bright eyes, which had always sparkled with warmth and curiosity, were now dull and sunken into her pale face, as if she hadn't slept in days or perhaps weeks. Her skin appeared paper-thin, sagging over her bones, and her clothes, usually so neat, hung loosely, stained and wrinkled. But it was the odor that hit him the hardest. It enveloped him in waves, an unpleasant mix of body odor, decay, and something sickeningly sweet, like rotting fruit left too long in a corner. Daniel's stomach churned, and he fought the urge to step back. "Mrs. Whitaker?" His voice trembled slightly despite his efforts to remain composed. "It's me, Daniel, your mailman. Are you okay?" She blinked at him slowly, as if processing his words required great effort. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse and weak, barely above a whisper. "Oh, Daniel, I'm fine, just a bit under the weather." Her words did nothing to reassure him. Instead, they deepened his concern. He could hear the slur in her speech, the sluggishness in her tone. Her once firm, confident voice was now fragile, as if it could break at any moment. Forcing a smile, Daniel attempted to hide his shock. "You don't look well, Mrs. Whitaker," he said gently. "Are you sure you don't need help? Maybe I can call a doctor for you." She waved him off with a trembling hand. "No need, dear. I just need some rest, that's all." But Daniel could see that rest wasn't what she truly needed. As she leaned against the doorframe for support, her frail body seemed barely able to hold her up. He glanced past her into the dimly lit living room, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The house, once spotless and welcoming, was in disarray. Piles of trash cluttered the floor. Old food containers were abandoned on the coffee table, and used tissues and crumpled papers were scattered everywhere. But what really unsettled him were the stacks of medical supplies, syringes, IV bags, and empty pill bottles, spread across the floor and tables, some half-opened as if abandoned mid-use. Dust coated the furniture, and the air inside felt thick and stagnant, as though it hadn't been ventilated in days. The smell that greeted him at the door now made sense. It was the scent of sickness, neglect, and decay, a house that had ceased to function as it once did. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't fathom what he was witnessing. How long had it been like this? How long had Mrs. Whitaker been struggling alone? "Mrs. Whitaker," Daniel began, choosing his words carefully, "I really think you need help. Can I call someone for you? A doctor, or maybe a family member?" She shook her head, a weak motion that seemed to drain the last of her energy. No, she insisted, her voice even quieter now. "I don't want to be a bother. I'll be fine in a few days. Just need to sleep it off." Her words, as calm as she tried to make them, only heightened Daniel's worry, but her dismissal, her insistence on handling it alone, constrained him. Mrs. Whitaker was proud and fiercely independent, never before asking for help. Still, Daniel couldn't just walk away. "Are you sure there's no one I can call?" he asked, his voice soft yet firm. "Even if it's just to check on you?" She offered a small, tired smile, but there was a hint of irritation behind it. "I'm sure, Daniel. You're a good boy for worrying, but I can manage." The door creaked as she began to close it. Daniel's heart sank. He wanted to insist, to push harder, but something held him back. He didn't want to overstep or make her uncomfortable, but as the door clicked shut, the image of her gaunt face and the smell of the house lingered in his mind, enveloping him like a suffocating fog. He stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, his mind racing. Everything inside him screamed that something was terribly wrong, that Mrs. Whitaker wasn't revealing the full story. But what could he do? She had refused his help. As Daniel slowly walked back to his van, his feet felt heavy, each step burdened by a sense of helplessness. His thoughts spiraled. What if she collapsed after he left? What if she didn't wake up tomorrow? What if this was the last time he'd ever see her alive? Back in his van, Daniel sat for a long while, gripping the steering wheel, his mind replaying the scene repeatedly. The smell, the clutter, the look in her eyes, it was all wrong. He knew it. His gut screamed at him not to leave things as they were. But what could he do? She had refused help. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of Mrs. Whitaker's house as the evening shadows crept across the lawn, turning the once bright house into a dark, foreboding silhouette. The guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't let it go. He wouldn't. As the van roared to life, Daniel made a decision. He'd return tomorrow. If things hadn't changed, if she still appeared unwell, if the house remained in disarray, he'd make the call. He didn't care if she was upset with him for it. He wouldn't forgive himself if something happened to her, and he had done nothing. The sun dipped below the horizon as Daniel pulled away from Chestnut Street, but the darkness in his heart had already settled long before. Daniel sat in the driver's seat of his van, staring at the house in the rearview mirror, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The shadows cast by the setting sun had engulfed Mrs. Whitaker's home, leaving it an ominous silhouette against the dimming sky. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening, replaying their brief conversation over and over. Could he really leave things as they were? Her hollow eyes, the mess inside, and the unmistakable smell of sickness, it all pointed to something far worse than she was letting on. He knew she didn't want help. Her pride wouldn't allow her to admit how dire things had become. But that very pride could be what endangered her. What if she doesn't wake up tomorrow? The thought hit him like a blow to the gut. The image of Mrs. Whitaker, alone in that decaying house, remained etched in his mind. His heart pounded in his chest as panic began to rise. He couldn't just sit here. He couldn't leave her like this. With shaking hands, Daniel reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, his heart pounding as he pondered whether to place the call. This wasn't part of his responsibilities. He was merely a mailman. What authority did he have to meddle in someone's private affairs? Yet, what kind of person would he become if he disregarded his instincts and something dreadful occurred? Eventually, Daniel took a deep breath and dialed. His hands trembled as he pressed the phone to his ear. "What's your emergency?" The operator's composed, professional voice sent a chill down his spine. There was no going back now. "My name is Daniel Rivera," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm a mailman, and I'm genuinely concerned about one of the residents on my route. Her name is Mrs. Whitaker. She resides at 243 Chestnut Street, and I believe she might be in serious trouble." The dispatcher immediately sensed the urgency in his tone. "Can you explain what's wrong? What makes you think she's in danger?" Daniel rushed through his explanation. The overflowing mailbox, the uncollected newspapers, her frail appearance, the disordered state of her home, and most alarmingly, the overwhelming feeling that she couldn't care for herself. "She looked really sick," he added. "I offered to help, but she declined. I'm worried she might not make it through the night if no one checks on her." The dispatcher's tone became slightly more serious. "Thank you for calling, Mr. Rivera. We're dispatching an officer and paramedics to perform a welfare check. Please stay where you are, and they'll arrive shortly." Daniel's heart raced as he ended the call. He sat in silence, the gravity of his actions weighing heavily on him. Had he made the right choice? Mrs. Whitaker might resent him for involving the authorities. She had always been fiercely independent and had clearly stated she didn't need help. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that, despite her protests, this was more significant than her pride. This was her life. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he sat there, anxiety gnawing at him. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if she had already collapsed? What if she couldn't even reach the door the next time someone knocked? Just as panic began to overwhelm him, Daniel noticed the flashing red and blue lights in the distance. A police cruiser and an ambulance appeared at the end of the street, their lights cutting through the dusk. Relief washed over him, tempered by a surge of fear. This was real now. Whatever happened next was beyond his control. He exited his van as the vehicles pulled up in front of Mrs. Whitaker's house. A young police officer, tall and stern-faced, stepped out of the cruiser, followed by two paramedics in neat uniforms. The officer glanced at Daniel before approaching him. "Are you the one who called this in?" the officer asked, his voice calm yet authoritative. Daniel nodded, feeling a blend of guilt and relief. "Yes, that was me. I'm Daniel, Mrs. Whitaker's mailman. She's been looking really sick, and her house, it's not right. She's not okay, but she wouldn't let me help." The officer gave him a measured look, seemingly assessing the situation's severity. "You did the right thing. We'll check on her." The paramedics grabbed their medical bags, and the officer headed toward the front door. Daniel watched from a distance, his heart in his throat, as the officer knocked firmly. The sound echoed through the quiet street, but once again, there was no immediate response. The officer knocked again, louder this time, calling out, "Mrs. Whitaker, it's the police. We're here to check on you. Can you come to the door?" A prolonged silence followed, stretching the tension to its breaking point. Daniel could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. What if she didn't answer this time? What if it was already too late? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they heard movement, slow, unsteady footsteps approaching the door. The officer and paramedics exchanged a glance as the door creaked open. Mrs. Whitaker stood in the doorway, looking worse than she had just hours earlier. Her pale skin appeared almost translucent in the porch light, her eyes dull and unfocused. She clutched the doorframe for support, her knuckles white. Even from a distance, Daniel could see her swaying slightly, as if she might collapse at any moment. "Ma'am," the officer said gently, stepping closer, "we're here to ensure you're okay. Can we come inside and take a look around?" Mrs. Whitaker blinked slowly, her face showing a mix of confusion and exhaustion. I told Daniel I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. "Just need some rest." Her words didn't align with her appearance. She looked far from fine. The paramedics moved forward, their expressions kind but professional. "Let us help you, Mrs. Whitaker," one of them said softly. "We're here to ensure you're safe." For a moment, Daniel feared she might refuse again, that her stubbornness would overpower her deteriorating condition. But as the paramedics gently guided her inside, her resistance seemed to diminish. She nodded weakly, allowing them to check her vitals and assess her condition. Daniel stood by the van, watching helplessly as the paramedics worked. He felt a heavy lump in his throat. This was worse than he'd imagined. If he hadn't called, if he'd left her to rest, he might be driving by her house tomorrow to find it empty forever. After a few tense minutes, the paramedics emerged from the house with Mrs. Whitaker on a stretcher, her frail body dwarfed by the blankets wrapped around her. Her eyes were half closed, and an oxygen mask covered her face. Daniel's heart broke at the sight of her, this once vibrant woman now reduced to such a fragile state. The officer approached Daniel. "She's severely dehydrated and malnourished. There's some evidence that she's been dealing with an illness, maybe cancer. We're taking her to the hospital now. It's a good thing you called when you did." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "Will she be okay?" The officer's expression softened. "She's in rough shape, but we'll know more once she's at the hospital. You might have just saved her life, Mr. Rivera." The words should have comforted him, but they only added to the weight in Daniel's chest. He had done the right thing, but the guilt still lingered. How had it gotten this bad without anyone noticing, without him noticing? As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the night, Daniel stood alone on the sidewalk, staring at Mrs. Whitaker's now empty house. The relief of having acted in time was overshadowed by the realization that she had been suffering for so long, alone, hidden behind the walls of her once welcoming home. He'd done all he could for now, but Daniel knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let Mrs. Whitaker face it alone. Daniel's heart raced as he watched the police officers standing in front of Mrs. Whitaker's door. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the weathered front steps. The officers knocked again, louder this time, their fists thudding against the wood with urgency. The entire street felt impossibly still, as though the world itself had paused to hold its breath. But there was no response. Daniel shifted his weight from foot to foot, his anxiety bubbling over. He could feel the tension radiating from the officers too. After what felt like an eternity, the lead officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then nodded. They were going to force their way in. Daniel's stomach turned as the officers positioned themselves, preparing to break the door down. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, echoing in the quiet night. As the door swung open, Daniel's pulse quickened. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as the officers disappeared inside. The front door now gaped open, revealing only darkness beyond. What would they find? The thought raced through his mind, each possibility more horrifying than the last. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. The neighborhood, usually so peaceful in the evening, suddenly felt oppressive, as though the air itself had thickened. Daniel strained to hear any sound from inside the house, a voice, movement, anything, but there was only silence. The tension was unbearable. Then, finally, a flicker of movement inside. The paramedics appeared first, hurrying into the house with their bags and equipment. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the cold sweat on the back of his neck as he continued to wait, helpless, on the curb. The image of Mrs. Whitaker standing frail in her doorway earlier that day haunted him. Had he waited too long? Was she worse off than he'd feared? The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Just when Daniel thought he couldn't stand it anymore, the paramedics emerged from the house and his stomach dropped. Mrs. Whitaker was barely visible beneath the layers of blankets on the stretcher. Her pale face looked smaller than ever, her cheeks hollowed, her silver hair a tangled mess against the stark white sheets. An IV line was hooked up to her frail arm, and an oxygen mask covered her mouth and nose, obscuring the lower half of her face. The beeping of the machines and the quiet hum of medical equipment broke the silence as the paramedics carefully wheeled her out toward the ambulance. Daniel's knees felt weak, his legs barely able to support him as the weight of what he was seeing settled over him. He hadn't truly realized just how bad it was until now. Mrs. Whitaker, who had always been so lively and independent, was almost unrecognizable in her current state. The image of her smiling, offering him lemonade on her porch in the summer, contrasted painfully with the woman now lying unconscious on a stretcher. One of the police officers approached Daniel, his face grim but calm. "You did the right thing calling us," he said, his voice steady. "Mrs. Whitaker is severely dehydrated and malnourished. She's also a cancer patient." He paused, his eyes softening as he continued. "It's a good thing you called when you did. We'll get her to the hospital. They'll take it from here. Cancer." Daniel's mind reeled. He hadn't known, she had never mentioned it, never said a word about being sick. The news hit him like a punch to the gut, and he struggled to find his voice. "Cancer? She never told me," he whispered, more to himself than to the officer. The officer nodded, his expression understanding. "Sometimes people don't like to talk about it. They think they can handle it on their own, or they don't want to burden others." Daniel's heart sank as he thought back to the times Mrs. Whitaker had spoken with him over the years, always so cheerful and full of life. She'd never shown any signs of being ill, never hinted that she was fighting such a brutal battle. How long had she been dealing with this? How long had she been suffering in silence? The officer gave Daniel a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "We'll take good care of her, don't worry. You probably saved her life tonight." The words should have brought comfort, but instead, Daniel felt a wave of guilt wash over him. How had he missed this? How had he not noticed? He had been delivering her mail for years. He knew her habits, her routines, and yet he had been completely oblivious to the fact that she had been fighting cancer alone. As the paramedics loaded Mrs. Whitaker into the ambulance, Daniel stood there, his body rooted to the spot as the flashing lights illuminated the scene. Neighbors had started to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion. They stood on their porches, watching with concern and curiosity. But none of them approached. No one knew what to say, and Daniel couldn't blame them. What could anyone say in a moment like this? The back doors of the ambulance closed with a final heavy thud. The engine roared to life, and the ambulance pulled away, its sirens wailing as it sped down the street, disappearing into the distance. Daniel watched it until the lights were nothing more than a faint blur on the horizon. The street was quiet again, the world seemingly returning to normal, but Daniel knew nothing would feel normal for him tonight. The officer's voice broke through the silence. "We'll follow up with her at the hospital," he said gently. "If you want, you can call and check on her tomorrow. She's in good hands now." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. His throat felt tight, and his chest ached with a heaviness he couldn't quite explain. He wanted to thank the officer, but all he could manage was a quiet, "Thank you." As the police cruiser pulled away, Daniel remained on the curb, staring at Mrs. Whitaker's darkened house. The front door was still ajar, a gaping reminder of the life that had been saved inside. Had he waited just one more day, had he ignored his gut feeling, things could have turned out very differently. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, and Daniel shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He couldn't shake the guilt, the nagging thought that maybe he should have seen the signs earlier. But then he reminded himself he had acted. He had made the call, and that decision had made all the difference. Daniel glanced up at the stars just beginning to peek through the twilight sky, their faint glow offering a sense of calm after the storm of emotions. Tomorrow he would go to the hospital. He needed to know Mrs. Whitaker was okay, to see her in a place where she could heal, where she wouldn't have to fight alone anymore. He climbed back into his van, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. His route wasn't finished, but for once the mail could wait. There were more important things in life than letters and packages. Tonight, Mrs. Whitaker was safe, and that was all that mattered. As he drove away from Chestnut Street, the night air cool on his face, Daniel felt the weight on his shoulders lift, just a little. He had done the right thing, and no matter how the future unfolded, he knew he wouldn't let Mrs. Whitaker go through it alone. The sterile, fluorescent lights of Jefferson Cherry Hill Hospital cast a harsh glow over the waiting area. The scent of antiseptic and the distant hum of hospital equipment filled the air, but Daniel was barely aware of his surroundings. He sat hunched in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his fingers clasped tightly together, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor beneath his feet. Hours had passed since the ambulance had whisked Mrs. Whitaker away, and each passing minute felt heavier than the last. The emergency room buzzed with activity, nurses hurrying from one station to the next, the soft murmur of families talking quietly amongst themselves. But it all felt distant to Daniel. His thoughts were consumed by what the doctors might be doing right now, what they might have found when they examined Mrs. Whitaker. He had wanted to follow the ambulance straight to the hospital, but protocol and the rush of the medical team had prevented him from entering right away. Instead, he had spent the better part of the evening pacing the waiting room, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him like a stone. Every time a nurse or doctor walked by, his heart skipped a beat, hoping they would have an update on Mrs. Whitaker. But each time, it wasn't for him. Now, as the clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, Daniel couldn't shake the growing knot of guilt in his stomach. How had he not known? How had someone as vibrant and kind-hearted as Mrs. Whitaker slipped through the cracks? She had been suffering right in front of him, and he had been oblivious. His mind replayed the last few weeks, the way she hadn't been waiting at the door like she usually did. The unkempt yard, the overflowing mailbox. The signs were all there, but he hadn't put them together until it was almost too late. He had been going about his daily routine, while Mrs. Whitaker was withering away inside her house. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. What if I had come earlier? The thought haunted him. If he had noticed just a little sooner, maybe things wouldn't have gotten so bad. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached him, clipboard in hand. She was middle-aged, with tired eyes that still held a sense of warmth beneath her professional demeanor. "Mr. Rivera?" she asked, her voice gentle. Daniel shot to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. Yes, that's me. How is she? Is she going to be okay? The doctor offered him a small, reassuring smile, though her eyes held a seriousness that Daniel didn't miss. I want you to know that your decision to call saved Mrs. Whitaker's life. If you hadn't acted when you did, she might not have made it through the night. The words hit Daniel with both relief and guilt. He had done the right thing, but the fact that it had come so close to disaster left him feeling hollow inside. She's stable for now, the doctor continued. But I won't lie to you, it's serious. Mrs. Whitaker is suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition. On top of that, her cancer has progressed significantly. Daniel's legs wobbled, and he sat back down heavily, the news overwhelming him. Cancer. He had known, of course, after hearing the officer mention it earlier, but to hear the doctor confirm how advanced it was made it real in a way he hadn't been prepared for. How bad is it? Daniel asked quietly, barely trusting his own voice. The doctor sighed, choosing her words carefully. Mrs. Whitaker's cancer has spread, and her body is very weak from the malnutrition and dehydration. She should have been receiving regular medical care, but it seems she hasn't been. We're doing everything we can, but it's going to be a difficult recovery. Daniel's mind raced. Why hadn't she told anyone? Why had she been suffering in silence all this time? He clenched his fists, anger mixing with his guilt. It wasn't fair. Mrs. Whitaker had always been so strong, so kind to everyone. She didn't deserve to go through this alone. How? How did it get this bad without anyone knowing? Daniel asked, his voice thick with emotion. The doctor shook her head, her face a mixture of empathy and frustration. It happens more often than you think. Elderly patients, especially those who live alone, can easily fall through the cracks. Mrs. Whitaker was discharged from another hospital not too long ago, but it seems she didn't receive the home care she needed. She should have had someone looking after her. Daniel's heart sank. She was supposed to get home care? Why didn't anyone come? That's a question we'll have to investigate, the doctor replied softly. Sometimes there are bureaucratic issues, paperwork gets lost, or insurance complications arise. It's unfortunate, but not uncommon. And sometimes patients don't follow up because they don't want to burden anyone. A burden. The word echoed in Daniel's mind. Mrs. Whitaker had never wanted to be a burden. That was why she had kept everything hidden, why she had refused his help at the door, and why she had tried to convince him she was fine when she clearly wasn't. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a moment of human connection in the sterile hospital environment. You did the right thing, Daniel. You gave her a fighting chance. Now it's up to us to make sure she gets the care she needs. With that, the doctor excused herself, leaving Daniel alone once more with his thoughts. He gazed at the wall ahead, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. Later, after what seemed like an endless stretch of time, Daniel was permitted to visit Mrs. Whitaker in her room. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath before entering. The rhythmic beeping of monitors welcomed him, and there she was, Mrs. Whitaker, lying in the hospital bed, her small frame overshadowed by the surrounding medical equipment. Her face was pale, eyes closed, and her chest rose and fell with each slow, labored breath. Tubes extended from her arms, and an oxygen mask was strapped across her face. For a moment Daniel hesitated, unsure if he should speak or if she could even hear him. Then her eyes fluttered open, appearing weak and unfocused. She blinked a few times, as though trying to recall her location, before her gaze settled on Daniel standing at the foot of her bed. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the mask. Daniel moved closer, his throat tight with emotion. "Hello, Mrs. Whitaker, it's me." She blinked again and a faint, weary smile touched her lips. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to worry you." Her words tightened Daniel's heart. Even now she was apologizing. He shook his head, battling the lump in his throat. "You have no reason to apologize. I should have come sooner. I should have noticed." She lifted a weak hand, her frail fingers trembling as they reached for his. "No, Daniel, you've always been so kind. I just didn't want to be a burden." Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he took her hand, gently squeezing it. "You're not a burden, Mrs. Whitaker. You've never been a burden. We're all here to help you. You don't have to go through this alone." She closed her eyes, tears escaping from the corners. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't stay in the hospital. My insurance wouldn't cover it. They said they'd send help, but no one ever came." Daniel's chest tightened with a mix of anger and sadness. How had the system failed her so completely? She had been left alone to fend for herself, and no one had checked in. Not even the hospital. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." Mrs. Whitaker opened her eyes again, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "You saved me, Daniel." "Thank you." Daniel squeezed her hand a little tighter, the weight of her words settling over him. He had saved her life, but it didn't feel like enough. There was still so much more to do. As they sat together in the dim hospital room, the steady beeping of the monitors in the background, Daniel made a silent promise. He wouldn't let her face this battle alone. Whatever happened next, he would be there, and so would the community. Mrs. Whitaker would receive the support she deserved. Holding Mrs. Whitaker's frail hand, Daniel felt the burden of her years of struggle, pride, and resilience. More than that, he felt the trust she had placed in him, a silent acknowledgement that she no longer had to bear this burden alone. Her pale fingers trembled slightly, but she clung to his hand as if drawing strength from the promise he had just made. "You're not a burden, Mrs. Whitaker," he repeated, his voice steady and resolute. "We're a community, and we take care of each other. I'll make sure you get the help you need, real help. Not just from the hospital, but from everyone who cares about you." Her tired eyes glistened with tears, and she nodded weakly. "I didn't want to bother anyone." She whispered, her voice frail but touched with a newfound softness. "You're never a bother," Daniel assured her. "You've spent so many years being there for others. Now it's time for us to be there for you." For a moment, a peaceful silence enveloped them, the beeping of the heart monitor and the soft hum of the machines blending into the background. In that shared quiet, Daniel felt a renewed sense of determination settle over him. He wasn't just going to leave Mrs. Whitaker to the whims of a broken system. He was going to rally the community, the very community that Mrs. Whitaker had been an integral part of for so many years. As Daniel stood up to leave, he looked down at Mrs. Whitaker, her eyes now closed, her breathing more steady, and her hand still resting in his. The doctors had told him that while her cancer was advanced, there was still hope. Treatment could still make a difference if she received proper care, nutrition, and support. But it would be a long journey, and she couldn't do it alone. Walking out of the hospital, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it was a responsibility he was prepared to carry. He wasn't just delivering mail anymore. He was delivering hope, and he had a plan. Upon reaching the parking lot, he took out his phone and dialed the first number that came to mind. "Lucy?" "It's Daniel," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "I need your help." Lucy, the warm-hearted owner of the local diner, had been a friend of Mrs. Whitaker's for years. She'd be the perfect person to start with, and Daniel knew she'd be ready to jump in without hesitation. "What's going on, Daniel? Is everything okay?" Lucy's concerned voice echoed through the line. "It's Mrs. Whitaker," he explained, his tone serious. "She's in the hospital. It's bad, but I think she'll be okay if we can get the community together to help her. She's been struggling, Lucy, and she's going to need more than just doctors. She's going to need us." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but Daniel could almost hear the gears turning in Lucy's head. Then, with a sense of urgency, she replied, "Tell me what you need and I'll make it happen." By the next morning, word had spread. Lucy had wasted no time calling the regulars who frequented her diner, and soon the small town of Cherry Hill was abuzz with concern for Mrs. Whitaker. It wasn't just gossip or idle chatter. There was genuine worry, and more importantly, a sense of responsibility. People who had known Mrs. Whitaker for decades, who had shared meals with her, attended church with her, or simply waved to her as they walked by, were ready to help. Lucy organized a fundraiser at the diner. A portion of every meal sold that week would go toward Mrs. Whitaker's medical bills and the cost of in-home care. Flyers were posted around town, and a donation box was set up at the counter, filling up faster than Daniel could have imagined. Even those who didn't have much to give still found a way to contribute, whether it was a home-cooked meal, a ride to the hospital, or simply offering to help around her house. Daniel made calls to other neighbors, seeking small commitments, someone to check in on her regularly, someone to assist with her grocery shopping, and someone to keep her garden tended so she could look out the window and see the flowers she loved. It wasn't long before he had a schedule in place, a true support system that Mrs. Whitaker could rely on. When Daniel returned to the hospital later that week, he brought with him the first batch of donations from the community. He carried an envelope filled with the names of everyone who had contributed, along with personal messages of encouragement and love. Mrs. Whitaker was sitting up in bed this time, looking frail but more alert. Her eyes widened when Daniel handed her the envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her voice raspy but stronger than before. "It's from everyone in the neighborhood," Daniel replied, smiling warmly. "They wanted to help. They've raised money for your care, and more importantly, they've promised to be there for you. You're not going through this alone anymore." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked through the notes. Names she hadn't heard in months, perhaps even years, filled the pages. Messages of support, small donations from people who didn't have much to give, and promises to be there for her. She had never imagined that so many people cared. I don't know what to say," she whispered, overcome with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Daniel said softly. "Just know that you have people who love you, and we're not going to let you go through this by yourself." Mrs. Whitaker nodded, wiping away a tear. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of hope. Not just the hope of recovery, but the hope of community, of people who would stand by her side, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. As Daniel left the hospital that evening, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not in himself, but in the community that had rallied around Mrs. Whitaker in her time of need. He had always loved his job as a mailman, delivering letters and packages that connected people to the world around them. But now, he realized that his role was so much more than that. He had delivered hope. Walking through the quiet streets of Cherry Hill, Daniel smiled to himself. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow over the town, and the air was cool and refreshing. He knew that Mrs. Whitaker still had a long road ahead of her, but she wouldn't be walking it alone. With the neighborhood support, and with the strength that she'd always carried inside her, she had a real chance at recovery. And as for Daniel, he knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more moments like this, more times when someone would need the strength of their community to help carry them through. But he was ready for it. He had learned that delivering mail wasn't just about letters and packages, it was about connecting people, about showing up for those who needed it most. And in that moment, he knew he would always be there. Back in Cherry Hill, life went on, but something had changed. Daniel's act of kindness had set off a ripple effect. Neighbors checked in on each other more often, and the sense of community grew stronger. Mrs. Whitaker's recovery was slow, but with Daniel and others by her side, she found the strength to keep fighting. In the end, this story wasn't just about one woman's battle with illness. It was about the power of compassion and the difference one person can make. What would you have done if you were in Daniel's shoes? Do you think you would have stepped in, or would you have hesitated? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the power of community and how we can all play a role in looking out for those who need us most. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video.